Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. When we think about the professors of Hogwarts, we usually imagine powerful wizards whose wisdom and skill commanded respect from both students and readers. However, not all teachers at the magical school were role models. Even the most respected among them made mistakes, and some committed downright disturbing acts. Today, we're diving into the darker side of teaching at Hogwarts. Ready? Let's begin. Number 1. Severus Snape projected his hatred for James Potter onto Harry. Snape is one of the most complex characters in the entire saga. It's hard to call him a villain. He's a hero in his own way. But he was far from a good teacher. From the very beginning, he chose to despise Harry simply because he was James Potter's son. Harry never did anything to deserve that treatment. But every time Snape looked at him, he seemed to see James. And even if deep down he knew Harry wasn't at fault, his behavior remained cold, harsh, and at times outright cruel. It had nothing to do with educational ethics, and certainly didn't help create a safe classroom environment. Number 2. Gilderoy Lockhart tried to obliviate Harry and Ron. At first glance, he was charming, smiling, and a little silly. But behind Lockhart's grin was a man who would do anything to protect his reputation. When the truth about his fake achievements came to light, he showed no remorse. Instead, he tried to erase Harry and Ron's memories. He wanted to run away, leaving them in the dark, while he made up a grand tale about his supposed heroic attempt to save Ginny. It was only Ron's nearly broken wand that saved the boys. The spell backfired and hit Lockhart himself, but that doesn't change the fact that he was fully prepared to cause serious harm to children to save his own skin. Number 3. Barty Crouch Jr. used unforgivable curses on students. Disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, one of Voldemort's Death Eaters infiltrated Hogwarts. Barty Crouch Jr., a talented dark wizard, created a convenient cover and brought terrifying teaching methods into the school. He didn't just demonstrate the unforgivable curses, he used them on students. The Imperious Curse, a spell of total mind control, is one of the most terrifying tools of power. Under its influence, Neville spun around the classroom like a puppet. It was a true shock, and no one even suspected who was hiding behind Moody's face. Number 4. Sybil Trelawney scared students with false predictions. Yes, Trelawney made only 2 real prophecies in her entire career. The rest? Pure drama, performance, gloomy forecasts, and over-the-top theatrics. She constantly made students anxious, especially sensitive ones like Harry. In Prisoner of Azkaban, she predicted his imminent death, which hit him hard. Only Professor McGonagall knew that Trelawney did this all the time, just to seem mysterious. As a result, many students spent years in fear and anxiety, caught in the trap of her pseudo-prophetic act. Number 5. Horace Slughorn gave Tom Riddle the idea of Horcruxes. Slughorn was a charming and intelligent teacher, but his desire to be close to the most promising students had devastating consequences. He saw Tom Riddle as a brilliant, refined young man, and when Tom asked about Horcruxes, Slughorn didn't realize what he was stepping into. He gave more than theory, he gave direction. Tom Riddle, who would become Voldemort, used that knowledge to fracture his soul and become nearly invincible. Slughorn would spend years haunted by the consequences of that mistake. Number 6. Rubeus Hagrid sent children to giant spiders. Yes, Hagrid has a heart of gold, but he has a serious blind spot, his love for dangerous, terrifying creatures, and sadly, that sometimes clouds his judgment. In Chamber of Secrets, he asks Harry and Ron to follow the spiders into the Forbidden Forest, straight to a colony of acromantulas. The result? They were almost eaten alive. These weren't just spiders, they were monsters. And Hagrid didn't seem to grasp how dangerous his request really was. Love for magical creatures is wonderful, but not when it puts children's lives in danger. Number 7. Minerva McGonagall sent children into the Forbidden Forest as punishment. Professor McGonagall was strict, fair, and deeply respected, but even she made choices that now seem shockingly reckless. In the Philosopher's Stone, when Harry, Hermione, Neville, and Draco were caught out of bed, she handed them detention, not with quills or chores, but with a trip into the Forbidden Forest. "You are to go into the forest and look for whatever has been killing the unicorns," Hagrid told them. It was midnight. The forest was home to centaurs, giant spiders, and worse. These were first-year students, barely 11. The task was beyond dangerous. Harry ended up face-to-face with a hooded figure drinking unicorn blood, later revealed to be Voldemort. Draco panicked and fled. Neville nearly cried. The risk was real. The forest was forbidden for a reason, and all of this McGonagall assigned as punishment for being out of bed. Students are not allowed into the Forbidden Forest, the rulebook says, except, apparently, when it's convenient to terrify them. A brilliant witch? No doubt. But that night, her judgment nearly got her students killed. Number 8, Quirinus Quirrell, let a troll into the castle. On Halloween night in the Philosopher's Stone, Hogwarts plunged into chaos. Professor Quirrell, stammering and pale, burst into the great hall with a cry, "Troll in the dungeons, thought you ought to know." Then he collapsed. Panic followed. Students screamed. Teachers scattered. But what no one knew at that moment was that Quirrell hadn't discovered the troll. He'd let it in. It wasn't an accident. It was a distraction, a calculated move to draw attention away from the third-floor corridor where the Sorcerer's Stone was hidden. The consequences could have been fatal. The troll found its way into the girls' bathroom where Hermione was alone. A creature 10 feet tall, armed with a club and no intelligence. "Swish and flick!" Ron shouted, trying to remember the levitation charm. If he and Harry hadn't arrived when they did, Hermione wouldn't have survived. Quirrell, under Voldemort's command, risked the lives of every student in the castle for a moment's access to a locked trapdoor. His cowardly appearance masked something far worse, his willingness to sacrifice children for dark magic. Number 9, Albus Dumbledore, allowed Harry to compete in the Triwizard Tournament. When Harry's name flew out of the Goblet of Fire, the entire room froze. He was 14, too young, too unprepared, and yet Dumbledore didn't stop it. "Did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire, Harry?" he asked, sharply, tensely, not like a man ready to protect a child, but like someone already preparing him for the battlefield. The rules were vague, the danger was real, and instead of challenging the decision, Dumbledore let it stand. He said later that magical contracts were binding, but was that really reason enough to risk a student's life? Each task nearly killed him. Dragons, mermaids, a hedge maze that twisted into madness. In the third task, the Triwizard Cup turned out to be a portkey, and Harry was transported straight into the hands of Lord Voldemort. Cedric Diggory died that night. Murdered. And Harry barely escaped. Dumbledore's gamble didn't just put Harry in danger, it opened the door to Voldemort's return. "You have shown bravery beyond anything I could have expected," Dumbledore told Harry afterward, but courage wasn't the point. Survival shouldn't have depended on it. Dumbledore loved to say that choices matter more than abilities. But this choice wasn't Harry's. It was Dumbledore's silence that left him trapped in a deadly tournament. He let a boy face monsters, mazes, and murderers because he believed in destiny. And maybe because deep down he knew the war had already begun. But that doesn't change the truth. He let a child walk into a trap and called it fate. Number 10. Phileas Flitwick ignored bullying within his own house. Professor Flitwick was beloved, small, cheerful, brilliant with charms, and always kind. But kindness isn't the same as awareness. As head of Ravenclaw House, he was responsible for the well-being of students like Cho Chang and Luna Lovegood. And while Cho suffered quietly under the weight of grief and gossip in Order of the Phoenix, Luna endured something worse. open ridicule. "Loony Lovegood," her classmates called her. They stole her shoes, laughed behind her back, and dismissed everything she said. And yet no teacher, especially not her head of house, ever stepped in to stop it. We never see Flitwick confront the bullying. Never hear him defend Luna's strange but harmless ways. She walked through the halls alone, her wand behind her ear, her voice soft and unfocused, and the school made her a target. "People used to believe there were no such things as Nargles," she said with a sad smile. "Luna didn't ask for protection, but that doesn't excuse the silence of those who could have offered it." Flitwick's absence in those moments felt louder than any spell he could have cast. Students at Hogwarts weren't just learning magic, they were learning how to live. And in those fragile years, being ignored can hurt more than being hexed. Luna remained strong. She didn't break, but she shouldn't have had to fight that battle alone. Flitwick's gentle heart was never in doubt, but sometimes gentleness isn't enough. Sometimes you have to speak. Number 11, Remus Lupin, hid his condition and endangered students. Remus Lupin was everything a defense against the dark arts teacher should be: kind, brilliant, and patient. Students loved him. Even Snape, bitter as he was, had to admit Lupin was competent. But love doesn't erase recklessness. Lupin had a secret he never told his students. He was a werewolf. "It is a very painful transformation," he later told Harry. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid." Afraid, maybe, but silence nearly cost lives. In The Prisoner of Azkaban during the full moon, Lupin forgot to take his wolfsbane potion and transformed inside the Hogwarts grounds. What followed was chaos. Lupin turned into a monstrous, howling beast. No longer professor, no longer friend, just fangs and fury. "Run!" Harry shouted to Hermione and Ron as the werewolf lunged across the grass. It was only thanks to Sirius Black, also transformed into his animagus dog form, that the children survived. One misstep, one slower reaction, and Remus would have torn them apart. No Hogwarts policy, no ministry rule, no ounce of logic can justify putting students in reach of a werewolf, even a gentle one. Dumbledore knew, Snape knew, but none of the students did. Not Neville, not Seamus, not even Hermione. Lupin gambled on secrecy. He trusted himself to stay in control. And yet the moment he slipped, the truth bared its teeth. We feel for him. He suffered. He deserved better, but so did the children he endangered. Silence isn't always noble. Sometimes it's the most dangerous thing of all. Number 12, Madam Hooch, turned a blind eye to violence in Quidditch. Madam Hooch was strict when it came to broomstick technique. She demanded focus, posture, precision. But when the Quidditch games began, something changed. Her whistle could pierce the air, but rarely the chaos. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, the match between Gryffindor and Slytherin unfolds in a storm. Rain hammers down. The wind is savage. And yet what truly makes the scene dangerous isn't the weather, it's the violence. Marcus Flint, the Slytherin captain, charges Oliver Wood with full force. Bludgers are aimed not just at random, but deliberately at players' heads. At one point, Draco Malfoy swerves into Harry with clear intent. Madam Hooch sees it. Everyone does. But all she offers is a shout. "Foul! Blatching!" Then the game thunders on. No timeout, no consequences, just bruised ribs and near collisions with the ground. It's as if injury is simply part of the fun. Fred and George Weasley are targeted repeatedly. Harry himself is pursued by a rogue Dementor, or rather, as we later learn, a swarm of them. The match descends into confusion. Harry faints mid-air. He falls from his broom, plummeting over 50 feet. His Nimbus 2000 is destroyed. Madam Hooch? Silent. There's no post-match press for answers, no inquiry into why soul-sucking creatures were allowed near school grounds during a sporting event. It's easy to call Quidditch rough, but the truth is, Hogwarts let children fly at breakneck speed, with minimal protection and zero emergency protocol. Madam Hooch, the adult in charge, treated it all as part of the game. No helmet, no substitute players, just school pride and broken bones. Her job wasn't just to blow the whistle. It was to protect the students, and in that she failed, again and again. Number 13, Pomona Sprout, exposed students to deadly mandrakes. Professor Sprout loved her plants more than anything. She was kind, practical, and deeply passionate about herbology, but sometimes her love for magical flora made her blind to the dangers they posed. In the Chamber of Secrets, she introduced her class to mandrakes, small, muddy-looking roots that screamed when pulled from their pots. As Sprout cheerfully explained, the cry of the mandrake is fatal to anyone who hears it. And then, with little more than a warning, she handed out earmuffs and told a group of second years to begin repotting them. Among those students were Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger. They were just 12 years old. Their only protection? Earmuffs. No charms, no magical barriers, just fabric over their ears and a hope that no one would slip. One mistake, one poorly fitted pair, and a student could be killed on the spot. It wasn't theoretical. Professor Sprout herself said, long exposure to the cry of a fully grown mandrake causes death. Even with her supervision, this felt reckless. The children struggled to hold the wriggling roots, trying not to scream or drop them. Neville Longbottom fainted, not from the mandrake's cry, but likely from fear and stress. Yet Sprout treated the lesson like a gardening exercise. She gave no sign that she realized how close her students were to real harm. In her mind, the lesson was valuable. In reality, it bordered on madness. The class survived, and the mandrakes were later used to revive petrified students. But the question remains, why did 12-year-olds need to handle such deadly plants in the first place? Sprout could have grown them herself. She could have used dummies or illusions for training. Instead, she made the children do it, cheerfully, as if it were part of everyday learning, all for science perhaps. But at what cost? Number 14, Charity Burbage, pushed a biased pro-Muggle agenda. Charity Burbage sat at the head of her classroom with the same calm smile she always wore. Her pale blue robes folded neatly around her chair, as though her lessons were never intended to challenge, but to enlighten. And yet many of her students left her classroom confused, unsettled, or even angry, not because of the subject she taught, but because of how she taught it. Muggle Studies, in theory, was a valuable course in bridging two worlds. But under Professor Burbage's guidance, it became something else entirely. Something more intrusive. Something that questioned not just ignorance, but identity. Her lessons often opened with magazine clippings from the Muggle world, shown to the class with the enthusiasm of someone introducing a miracle. She praised their technological wonders, their modes of transportation, and even their governments. They may lack magic, she once told a group of fifth years, but they have something more powerful, progress. The word hung in the air like an accusation. For students raised in traditional wizarding households, the implication was clear. Magic was backward. Their culture, their upbringing, even their parents, outdated relics of a world that should have already faded away. One could forgive an occasional controversial opinion in a school where independent thinking was supposedly encouraged. But Burbage's commentary didn't feel like free thought. It felt like indoctrination. In one particularly memorable lesson, she compared the Wizengamot, the ancient magical court, to what she called the impartial and superior legal systems of the Muggle world. Her claim that Muggle trials demand more evidence and offer greater fairness wasn't just debatable, it was a direct challenge to the foundations of wizarding society. She dismissed the magical community's centuries-old customs as inferior without offering nuance, acting as though her version of justice were the only acceptable truth. A young student named Theodore Knott once left her classroom with clenched fists. Raised by a pure-blood father with deep ties to wizarding traditions, Theodore found her dismissiveness not only arrogant, but deeply insulting. "It's not her job to like muggles more than us," he muttered to his friend in the corridor. "It's her job to teach." His sentiments weren't rare. Even students who didn't share his upbringing found themselves at odds with Burbage's unyielding perspective. Hermione Granger, known for her Muggle heritage and love for knowledge, avoided Muggle studies entirely. Whether it was because she felt she needed no formal education in her own background, or because she found Burbage's version of it distorted, is left to speculation. It wasn't just what Burbage said, it was what she refused to acknowledge. She never discussed the darker aspects of Muggle history: wars, colonization, pollution, or prejudice. Instead, she painted a romantic picture of Muggles as peaceful, rational, and morally superior. "They have managed to live without magic," she once declared to a stunned class, "and in many ways that makes them better than us." The silence that followed wasn't respectful contemplation, it was disbelief. To be told without context that your way of life was lesser simply because it included magic wasn't a bridge toward tolerance, it was a form of shaming. Her lectures gradually stopped being about comparison and became sermons. Students who asked difficult questions, like Pansy Parkinson, who once inquired about the Muggle tendency toward violence, were brushed aside. "That's a stereotype," Burbage said sharply, "and unhelpful." But the facts were more complicated. Muggle history is filled with bloodshed, much like magical history. By refusing to address these complexities, Burbage wasn't promoting understanding. She was cultivating idealism, dangerous, one-sided idealism. There were other moments that raised eyebrows. During a History of Magic crossover lesson, she openly criticized the Statute of Secrecy. She claimed it was a shameful legacy of fear, and hinted that the magical world's decision to hide had stunted cultural evolution. Professor Binns, who co-taught the class that day, offered no comment, perhaps because, being a ghost, he had long ceased engaging in such debates. But her message was unmistakable. Wizarding separation wasn't just unfortunate, it was wrong. "We are capable of more," she said, "and they, Muggles, deserve more." A noble sentiment, perhaps, but again, it lacked balance. The Statute of Secrecy had been created to protect both worlds. To ignore the dangers it addressed was to ignore centuries of persecution. More troubling was her treatment of magical bloodlines. While she never outright insulted pure blood families, her tone was often laced with disdain when discussing old magical ideologies. Students from such lineages felt alienated, accused without trial. "We are more than our ancestry," Daphne Greengrass once remarked in the Slytherin common room, "but Professor Burbage makes it feel like our ancestry is a crime." These were not the thoughts of children rebelling against open-mindedness. They were the sentiments of young minds pushed into defensive corners. Even her colleagues began to grow uneasy. Professor McGonagall, known for her fairness, once subtly cautioned Burbage during a staff meeting. According to an unnamed source, McGonagall remarked that advocacy is not the same as instruction. It was a diplomatic comment, but a loaded one. The line between education and political persuasion had become blurred in Burbage's classroom. Her intent may have been inclusion, but the effect was division. The most damning example of Burbage's ideological zeal came when she published an article in the Daily Prophet arguing for intermarriage between Muggles and wizards. The article, titled "Magical Blood is a Myth," was a lightning rod for controversy. In it, she claimed that there is no benefit to keeping wizarding bloodlines pure and that our future lies in integration with non-magical society. The piece infuriated many, some because of its scientific inaccuracies, others because of its complete disregard for magical cultural heritage. Her central argument wasn't just that Muggle-borns deserved equality, something few would contest, it was that pure blood culture was obsolete. The blowback was swift. Letters poured into the Daily Prophet, some in support, many in opposition. "She's not wrong, but she's not helping," wrote one anonymous reader. The article didn't inspire dialogue, it incited outrage, and worse, it painted an entire culture with a single, condemning brush. Burbage's writing may have been well-intentioned, but it carried the arrogance of someone who believed they held the only moral compass worth following. Number 15, Dolores Umbridge, used magical torture on students. There is a special kind of villain that hides behind rules, cloaks tyranny in pink cardigans, and speaks with a sweet, shrill voice while carving words into the skin of children. Dolores Jane Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic and briefly Hogwarts High Inquisitor, was not a Death Eater, nor did she follow Voldemort. Yet the damage she inflicted on Hogwarts remains one of the most chilling displays of sanctioned cruelty in the entire wizarding world. When she was installed at the school during Harry Potter's 5th year, she brought not guidance, but oppression, a soft-spoken brutality that operated under the guise of discipline and order. Her office was decorated with lace, decorative plates of purring kittens, and pink furniture, but beneath the surface it was a chamber of horrors. Dolores Umbridge did not believe in corporal punishment. She believed in something much worse, psychological torment hidden in plain sight. The most disturbing tool in her arsenal was a magical quill, one that did not require ink because it used the blood of the person writing. The wounds carved by this quill did not simply appear. They were etched, letter by agonizing letter, into the flesh of the user. And the words they wrote remained not only on parchment, but on their skin, permanently. Harry Potter, a 15-year-old boy already burdened by loss, trauma, and responsibility, became the target of this woman's wrath. His crime? Declaring the truth that Lord Voldemort had returned. The Ministry of Magic, in an attempt to suppress panic and preserve their illusion of control, called him a liar. Dolores Umbridge, their chosen enforcer, was sent to Hogwarts not to teach, but to silence. And when Harry refused to recant his story, she assigned him detention. He was made to write, over and over, "I must not tell lies." The phrase, seemingly harmless, became a mark of suffering. With every repetition, the quill carved the sentence into the back of his hand, a slow, burning wound that bled into his soul. K. Rowling describes the moment vividly in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. He let out a gasp of pain. The words had been cut into the back of his hand, and they stung horribly, as though his skin had been scraped with a knife. This was not punishment. It was torture, administered by a teacher inside a school that claimed to protect its students. Worse still, it was designed to be invisible to others, silent, hidden, a form of psychological abuse that left no trace unless the victim chose to reveal it. Harry did not report the punishment. Like many victims of abuse, he believed no one would believe him, and he feared that complaining would only make things worse. Indeed, when Hermione Granger discovered the wound, she was horrified, but the system had already failed them. Dumbledore, driven into forced neutrality by the Ministry's pressure, remained distant. The other teachers, bound by the new authority structure, were powerless. The students were alone. Dolores Umbridge had been granted the title of High Inquisitor, a position that gave her sweeping power to evaluate and fire professors, rewrite school policy, and enforce ministry-approved dogma. In practice, it gave her the right to terrorize. She disbanded student groups for bad practical defense lessons and encouraged students to report each other. Paranoia blossomed in the corridors of Hogwarts and trust withered. Her quill, which she kept in a tidy drawer beside her cat-shaped paperweight, was only one of many instruments in her campaign of control, but it was the most personal. It was a weapon used to break the will of the individual. Another student who suffered under Umbridge's regime was Lee Jordan. Known for his humor and confidence, Lee was no stranger to detention. But under Umbridge, detention became something else. He too received the quill punishment after speaking out against her unfair treatment of others. Though we are not shown his scars in the same way we see Harry's, the implication is clear. The practice was not isolated, it was systemic. And it was not simply the use of the quill that shocked. It was the casual, bureaucratic manner in which Umbridge administered this torment. She did not scream, she did not rage. She smiled, sipping tea from a kitten-covered cup, as a child's flesh split open beneath her orders. This was what made her so terrifying. She believed she was right. She believed that she was instilling order, that discipline required pain, and that dissent was the enemy of peace. To her, Harry was not a boy, he was a threat to the establishment. In one especially haunting scene, Harry returns from detention with his hand bleeding, and still she insists that he is learning. The perverse inversion of truth, punishing someone for speaking it, and labeling that punishment as education, was the very essence of her rule. It was not enough to hurt the students. She had to convince them that they deserved it. That, in the words of Orwell, is the power to make someone say that 2 + 2 = 5. There was a peculiar silence around her actions. Other students whispered, but fear kept them from speaking. Luna Lovegood, who always saw through appearances, once commented, "She's got a lot of enemies, though. That's what happens when you're mean to people." But even Luna's insight could not change the reality. The Hogwarts staff knew, the students knew, but as long as Umbridge operated under the Ministry's seal, she was untouchable. Even Dumbledore, who stood for justice, knew that intervening would cost him the school. It is worth noting that the scars on Harry's hand never fully healed. They became a symbol, one he carried long after the war ended, long after Voldemort was defeated and peace returned. The words, "I must not tell lies," remained with him, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous villains are not the ones who kill, but the ones who twist the truth and disguise abuse as authority. Number 16, Gilderoy Lockhart, stole others' accomplishments and erased memories. Gilderoy Lockhart's office was a shrine to his own face. Framed portraits of himself grinned from every angle, eyes glinting with saccharine self-satisfaction. Shelves groaned under the weight of books titled with absurd bravado, "Magical Me," "Wandering with Werewolves," "Break with a Banshee." To the untrained eye, Lockhart was a paragon of magical prowess and courageous feats. To those who knew better, his story was far darker. Behind every signed photo was a stolen memory. Behind every dazzling smile, a destroyed life. The most insidious part of Lockhart's deception was not merely the theft of credit. It was the theft of identity, memory, and history. The man did not borrow tales. He erased their origins. Real heroes, men and women who had survived horrors most witches and wizards could barely imagine, were reduced to confused, hollow shells of themselves. They had their memories stripped away with a charm that sparkled on the surface, the obliviate, but left irreversible scars beneath. He did not just lie to the world, he silenced those who had every right to speak. Take the case of old Blenkinsop, a Cornish wizard known in his village for slaying the serpent of Tregantle Wood, a beast so ancient it had scales like rusted iron and eyes the colour of ash. Blenkinsop had trained for months, armed with nothing but his father's wand and the whispered legends of his ancestors. His victory, however, became a footnote in Lockhart's travels with trolls, where the heroic author claimed to have vanquished the creature with a single, well-timed hex. The real Blenkinsop was later found muttering to himself in St. Mungo's, unable to recall even his own name. Lockhart had visited him under the pretense of an interview and left him a ruined man. It was not just bravery that Lockhart stole, it was legacy. Whole communities believed him to be the saviour they had never actually seen. Children idolized him. Parents sent their young to Hogwarts, eager for their sons and daughters to learn from the man who claimed to have defeated a Yetiar bare-handed. Yet the Yeti, as revealed years later, had been stunned into submission by a Tibetan witch named Tenzi Dorji. Her account, written in a barely circulated regional journal, told a different story. one of preparation, fear, and sacrifice. She had nearly died. Lockhart had merely arrived afterward. The irony of Lockhart's eventual downfall was not lost on anyone who truly understood his crimes. His own backfiring spell left him memoryless, trapped in the very oblivion he had inflicted on so many. It felt almost poetic, but not nearly enough. The damage he caused was irreversible. The people he erased did not get their stories back. Their names remained forgotten in the shadows of his gleaming, fabricated legend. In Chamber of Secrets, Dumbledore's words echoed with quiet condemnation. The mind is not a book, to be opened at will and examined at leisure. Lockhart had done far worse. He had ripped out entire chapters from the minds of others. During his brief tenure at Hogwarts, Lockhart's vanity was obvious. He gave detentions that required students to address fan mail. He staged duels where he accidentally revealed his own supposed brilliance. He offered endless anecdotes of false valor. Yet no one, not even McGonagall, not even Snape, suspected the extent of his deceit. That's because he didn't just lie well. He used magic to erase the possibility of contradiction. The Obliviate charm is not a harmless flick of the wand in skilled hands. It can precisely remove traumatic memories. In Lockhart's, it was a weapon of suppression. The ethics of such magic were well known. Memory charms had strict guidelines, typically employed by the Ministry under exceptional circumstances, but Lockhart used them casually, arrogantly. Each victim was a stepping stone to greater fame. He turned acts of courage into personal profit. When he bragged about surviving the Wagga Wagga werewolf incident, he was speaking of an event actually faced by an Australian wizard named Clive Heatherton, who had lost 3 fingers and spent months recovering in a backwater clinic. Lockhart had arrived with a photographer, jotted down a few notes, and erased Heatherton's account from his own mind. This wasn't plagiarism, it was magical assault. He left his victims with no means of regaining their truth. They could not defend themselves. They often didn't know what had happened at all. When Rita Skeeter tried to investigate one such case in 1991, she found herself stonewalled. No one remembered what Lockhart had done, not because they were silent, but because they had been forcibly silenced. In an article that was never published, she wrote, "Lockhart does not write books, he writes tombstones for the living." Even his fans, so enamored with his charisma, began to notice the cracks. The real events described in his books were inconsistent with known magical theory. Several of his stories relied on spells that didn't exist or contradicted the laws of magical transmutation. In Gadding with Ghouls, he described using the Hex of Ravenous Light, a spell no other witch or wizard had heard of, and which no spellbook contained. When asked to demonstrate it, Lockhart laughed it off, calling it too dangerous. In truth, he had likely copied the name from a foreign incantation and hoped no one would question it. The academic community remained strangely silent. Some out of fear of crossing a popular figure, others out of sheer disbelief. Who would imagine that a man so publicly adored could be so fundamentally corrupt? Lockhart relied on this incredulity. He built his career on the assumption that no one would dare pull back the curtain, and if they did, they would forget they ever tried. Number 17, Albus Dumbledore, kept the prophecy from Harry. Of all the controversial moments in the Harry Potter saga, perhaps none is as morally complicated and emotionally resonant as Albus Dumbledore's decision to withhold the prophecy from Harry Potter. At the heart of this choice lies not only the fate of a single boy, but the entire wizarding world. The boy who lived was, for years, kept in deliberate ignorance of the fact that he was, according to a prophecy made by Sybil Trelawney, the only one capable of vanquishing Lord Voldemort. The weight of that decision to guard a child from the burden of destiny or to prepare him for it remains one of Dumbledore's most questionable acts. From the moment Harry set foot in Hogwarts, Dumbledore was present in his life as a towering, benevolent figure. He was the protector, the wise guide, the silent architect behind so many of the events that unfolded. And yet, behind the warmth of twinkling eyes and lemon drop-offers, Dumbledore harboured a secret that would change everything Harry knew about himself. The prophecy, made in the Hog's Head Inn during Trelawney's job interview, stated that the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born as the 7th month, dies. Dumbledore learned of this prophecy shortly after it was uttered, and he knew, long before Harry ever did, that this boy was destined to either destroy or be destroyed by Voldemort. Still, year after year, Dumbledore chose silence. He watched as Harry faced danger in the Philosopher's Stone chambers, battled a basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets, fought Dementors, and discovered his godfather in Azkaban, and entered the deadly Triwizard Tournament, all without knowing the full truth of who he was and why these things happened to him. Each time Harry emerged victorious, Dumbledore's silence grew heavier, weighed down not by doubt, but by deliberate intent. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry himself reflects on this growing distance, describing Dumbledore as someone who had avoided his eyes for months. Dumbledore would later defend his actions by claiming that he sought to protect Harry's innocence for as long as possible. In the Order of the Phoenix, he says, "I cared about you too much. I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth, more for your peace of mind than my plan." But Harry was not a fragile flower. He had braved death countless times, lost his parents, endured the Dursleys, and faced creatures far beyond his years. The very idea that he could not handle the truth seems not only condescending, but deeply flawed. It is an example of Dumbledore's tendency to believe he alone could bear the weight of the world's decisions. When the truth finally came out in Dumbledore's office after the death of Sirius Black, it was like a dam breaking. Harry's grief was compounded by the realization that he had been manipulated, kept in the dark, made a pawn in a game he did not know he was playing. He smashed Dumbledore's possessions in a furious rage, an expression of betrayal so deep it shook the walls of the headmaster's office. He had been denied his agency, his right to know, to choose, to prepare. "You knew," he shouted in the book. "You knew it was me." And Dumbledore, to his credit, did not deny it. The damage had already been done. Harry's trust, though eventually mended, had been shattered in a moment of raw truth. It is one thing to be thrust into a war. It is another to realize that the general had been using you as his final weapon all along. The prophecy, in Dumbledore's words, was a self-fulfilling one, but it remained tied to Harry's identity. He had to die to defeat Voldemort. Neither can live while the other survives, and Dumbledore had known this since Harry was a baby. In The Half-Blood Prince, we see how Dumbledore begins to prepare Harry for this eventual confrontation, offering him memories and insights into Voldemort's past. But by then, it is a process of catch-up, an attempt to fill in years of missing knowledge. The irony is that this instruction came not from a place of empowerment, but of resignation. Dumbledore himself was dying, and only then did he begin to truly open the vaults of secrets that had bound Harry in ignorance. The moral dilemma at the core of Dumbledore's decision is whether knowledge is a burden or a right. He chose to delay Harry's understanding of his role in the war, a decision that can be seen as both protective and manipulative. Yet what he failed to grasp was that information is not the enemy, helplessness is. And Harry, time and again, had proven that he did not need coddling. He needed clarity. It's also worth noting that Dumbledore did not simply hide the prophecy. He allowed others to dance around it. Snape, McGonagall, even members of the Order, none were given permission to enlighten Harry, though many must have known fragments of the truth. It was an orchestrated silence, and its consequences were severe. Harry's emotional volatility in Order of the Phoenix, his sense of isolation, his nightmares, his growing anger, was not solely due to Voldemort's influence. It was the result of being treated like a child when he was already a soldier. This moment in the narrative illustrates Dumbledore's fatal flaw, his inability to see those around him as equals in the fight. He was the master planner, always 3 moves ahead, but chess is a game where the pieces don't feel pain. Harry did, and that pain was compounded by the belief that he had not only lost Sirius to Voldemort, but perhaps also to Dumbledore's inaction. Even more chilling is the implication that Dumbledore saw Harry's death as a necessary step. In Deathly Hallows, Harry finally understands that he is a Horcrux. That part of Voldemort lives inside him, and that he must die for Voldemort to be truly vanquished. This knowledge had been Dumbledore's for years. He never told Harry. He planned to reveal it only when the time came, when there would be no turning back. That plan, no matter how noble the goal, strips Harry of his right to make that choice early on. And yet, Harry chose to die. When the moment arrived when Voldemort waited in the Forbidden Forest, Harry walked to his fate, not as a weapon, but as a man. He chose sacrifice with full awareness, and that choice saved the wizarding world. But how much stronger might he have been, how much more at peace, had he known the truth earlier? Could he have spared himself years of confusion and emotional agony? In the aftermath, we are left with a portrait of Dumbledore that is not diminished, but made more human. He is no longer the infallible genius, but a deeply flawed man, haunted by his own past, terrified of repeating the mistakes that led to his sister, Ariana's death. "I was afraid," he told Harry in King's Cross, "that your hot head might dominate your good heart. But was that fear an excuse or an honest confession of weakness?" The world saw Dumbledore as the greatest wizard of the age, but behind that grandeur was a man who had lost too much to risk losing again. He was, in many ways, a prisoner of his own guilt. But that does not absolve him. His choice to hide the prophecy shaped Harry's adolescence, framed his understanding of the world, and perhaps even defined the kind of man he became. The betrayal Harry felt was not just about secrecy, it was about control. Dumbledore, in withholding the prophecy, took away Harry's ability to define his own life. Even though the prophecy itself could have been meaningless, after all, Voldemort made it real by acting on it. Its very existence shaped every step of Harry's journey. He had a right to know, and being told that truth when he was ready, not when Dumbledore was ready, would have respected his growth as a person. That Dumbledore admitted his fault, that he showed remorse, is perhaps the only reason his legacy remains intact. He told Harry in Half-Blood Prince, "I make mistakes like the next man. In fact, being rather cleverer than most men, my mistakes tend to be correspondingly huger." There is honesty in that, and a touch of humility, but it comes only after years of manipulation. Harry's forgiveness was not automatic. It came through understanding, through time, and through his recognition that even the wisest of mentors can be terribly wrong. In the end, Harry named his son after Dumbledore, calling him one of the bravest men I ever knew. But bravery is not always wisdom, and love is not always clarity. Dumbledore loved Harry, but in that love was a kind of control that echoed with danger. The prophecy, had it been told earlier, might not have changed Harry's path, but it would have made that path one he chose, not one chosen for him. And in a series that values courage, loyalty, and free will, the withholding of that truth stands out as a betrayal of those very ideals. Dumbledore's legacy is complex. He saved lives, protected the school, fought evil, but he also manipulated a child for the greater good. That duality is what makes his character so enduring and his decisions so worthy of scrutiny. The prophecy may have belonged to Harry, but for too long it was Dumbledore who held the key, and in doing so he taught us all that even heroes have shadows. Number 18, Albus Dumbledore, left Harry with abusive relatives. Albus Dumbledore stood alone that fateful night on Privet Drive, robes brushing the ground, silver instruments ticking silently in the shadows. In his hand, a letter. At his feet, a baby boy with a lightning-shaped scar. Behind the curtains, Petunia Dursley waited, unaware her life was about to change. That single decision to leave Harry Potter on the doorstep of number 4 shaped not just the boy's future, but the trajectory of the wizarding world. And though many still call it wise, others whisper that it was cruel, perhaps even calculated. Dumbledore knew Petunia Evans Dursley. He had once denied her entrance into Hogwarts. He had seen the letter she wrote, begging to attend the school her sister Lily had been accepted into. He had seen the resentment take root, saw how the rejection turned into disdain, first for magic, then for her magical sister. Dumbledore knew that placing a magical child with a woman embittered by her own exclusion from that world would not be a recipe for love. He did it anyway. More than that, he knew Vernon Dursley. If not personally, then by extension. He understood the kind of man who would marry someone like Petunia. Bigoted, proud, narrow-minded. Vernon, a man whose world revolved around normalcy, lawn care, and drill manufacturing. A man who exploded at anything he couldn't understand. And magic terrified him. The idea that Dumbledore would entrust the last hope of the wizarding world to such people raises not only questions, it invites moral scrutiny. The justification, as Dumbledore once explained, lies in an ancient magic, an enchantment forged through blood. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells, there you cannot be touched or harmed by Voldemort, he later told Harry. Petunia, as Lily's sister, carried that protective blood. As long as Harry lived with her, the protection Lily's sacrifice invoked would remain. But even that explanation fails to erase the harshness of the choice. It was not just a matter of sheltering Harry. It was about submitting him to years of psychological harm. Harry's cupboard under the stairs was not just a room. It was a symbol. The smallest room in the house, cold, dark, with spiders in the corners, and barely enough space for a small mattress. At the age of 11, Harry still wore Dudley's hand-me-downs, hung off his frame like a scarecrow's rags. He was never celebrated on his birthday, never received a Christmas gift. Once he was punished for growing his hair back overnight. On another occasion he was locked in the cupboard for days because of a magical incident involving a boa constrictor at the zoo. All of this Dumbledore could have predicted. The man who outwitted Grindelwald, who devised complex protections for the Philosopher's Stone, and who orchestrated the resistance against Voldemort, could not have been unaware of the emotional toll the Dursleys would inflict. Dumbledore was not naive. He had eyes and ears everywhere. Arabella Figg, a squib who lived down the street, had one job: to watch Harry. And she reported back. She knew how Harry was treated, the stale food, the locked cupboard, the way he was excluded from family outings, and Dumbledore knew it all. Harry's life was one of silence and neglect. The emotional scars ran deep. At Hogwarts he was astonished when people celebrated his birthday. Ron gave him a sweater, Hagrid baked him a cake. These were acts so small, yet they shook Harry's very world. The fact that a boy could reach 11 years old and be surprised by a birthday card is heartbreaking, and it did not happen by accident. It was the consequence of Dumbledore's decision. In Order of the Phoenix, after a disastrous summer and near expulsion, Harry finally confronts Dumbledore in his office. His fury boils over. "You don't know how it feels. Your parents are dead, you have no family." And Dumbledore's face shows pain, but he does not apologize. He never once tells Harry that he regrets leaving him there. He insists it was necessary, strategic, sacrificial. But what is the moral weight of a strategy that costs a child his entire childhood? Dumbledore's own history is filled with sacrifice. He sacrificed his sister's life by pursuing power. He sacrificed his friendship with Grindelwald. He even sacrificed his own future when he drank the potion in the cave that destroyed his strength. Sacrifice was in his blood, but did he have the right to sacrifice someone else's life someone else's childhood, for the greater good. The letter he left on the Dursleys' doorstep was not just a note. It was a spell in itself of control. Dumbledore told Petunia that she was bound by blood to protect the boy. He invoked a mother's dying wish and transformed it into magical chains. Whether Petunia liked it or not, she was now a gatekeeper to Harry's survival, and she resented it. Her bitterness only grew with time, and she poured it into every cold look, every cruel silence, every refusal to acknowledge Harry's pain. When Sirius Black offered to take Harry, Dumbledore refused. It could have been different. Sirius, though reckless, loved Harry. He had been willing to die for him. Yet Dumbledore insisted Harry stay with the Dursleys. Even later, when Remus Lupin re-entered Harry's life, nothing changed. The boy still returned every summer to a place where love did not exist. The message was clear: strategy above comfort, security above affection. And yet, in the very first book, Hagrid exclaims, if I'd known what they were like, you should have told me." The groundskeeper, rough and simple as he was, understood that love mattered. Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, chose otherwise. He gambled Harry's emotional well-being for an ancient enchantment that would become irrelevant the moment Harry came of age. Years later, in Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore's portrait finally offers a form of remorse. He admits to planning too much, controlling too tightly, trusting in fate more than people. "I cared more for your happiness than you could have known," he tells Harry posthumously. But caring is not the same as protecting. Knowing that someone might suffer and allowing it to happen for strategic reasons is not care, it's calculation. The tragedy deepens when we learn that Dumbledore himself was once a boy filled with dreams and pain. He had a sister who was mentally unstable after a magical attack. He had a brother who resented him. He knew the cost of childhood trauma, and still he placed Harry into a home that echoed his own family's fractures. Some argue that Dumbledore wanted Harry to grow up away from fame, to be humble, grounded. But there's a difference between humility and humiliation. Harry wasn't just modest, he was broken. He doubted his self-worth, questioned whether he deserved love, and only felt seen when he was doing something heroic. That is not balance, that is damage. The boy who lived could have been the boy who thrived. If raised in a loving, magical home with guidance and care, Harry might have grown with joy instead of sorrow. Instead, he became a soldier by necessity, shaped by neglect. Every duel he won, every prophecy he fulfilled, carried with it the echoes of a child who once dreamed of a friend, a meal, or a bed not in a cupboard. We must also question the long-term effects. Harry's trust in authority was deeply fractured. He questioned the ministry. He disobeyed Umbridge. He created Dumbledore's army. In each case, he operated from a place of inner resistance, a distrust born not of rebellion, but of having been abandoned. The boy who was not believed when he spoke of Voldemort's return had already lived a decade of not being heard. Even Snape, in his bitter way, understood. "You see what you expect to see, Dumbledore," he snarled in Half-Blood Prince. And perhaps Dumbledore did. He expected Harry to rise above his suffering. And Harry did. But that doesn't mean the suffering was justified. Neville Longbottom, raised by his grandmother, still bore scars of another kind, but he was loved. He was awkward, hesitant. But he knew kindness. Harry was more powerful, more famous, but lonelier. And loneliness, especially when given to a child, is not a gift. It is a wound. Ultimately, Harry forgave Dumbledore. He even named his son after him. But forgiveness does not rewrite the past. It merely honors the pain by letting it go. And even in forgiveness there is an unspoken truth. Harry's life was not what it could have been. And Dumbledore's choice, for all its wisdom, left a scar deeper than the one on Harry's forehead. Number 19. Sybil Trelawney, frequently taught under the influence of alcohol. In the winding corridors of Hogwarts, some mysteries were carefully tucked away behind locked doors, shrouded in perfumed veils and wafts of incense. Few, however, were as persistent or as quietly tragic as the story of Professor Sybil Trelawney. Students often laughed at her theatrical entrances, her shimmering shawls, and her ominous predictions of death and despair. But if one were to look past the crystal balls and sherry-soaked breath, a more sobering picture emerged, a professor teetering on the edge of her own unravelling, held up by clinking bottles and fading prestige. When Harry Potter first encountered Professor Trelawney, she appeared more like a performer than a scholar. Her divination classroom was a haze of rich perfumes, velvet cushions and low lighting, the kind that lulled students into a daze long before any inner eye could open. Yet beyond the theatrics there were moments that felt too unstable to be merely eccentricity. In Order of the Phoenix, Trelawney appears in the hallway with a glass clutched in her trembling hand, and her speech is muddled. She mutters to herself, unaware or uncaring of the students who pass her by. "I'm not leaving," she cries. "Tell Dumbledore I'm not leaving." Her words, smeared with emotion and panic, fall out of her mouth not just as a result of distress, but seemingly under the influence of something stronger than mere anxiety. That particular encounter is telling. She had just been sacked by Dolores Umbridge, who was rapidly tearing Hogwarts apart with her cruelty. But Trelawney's reaction, unbalanced and drenched in self-pity, had all the markers of a person already too far gone. The wine-red tinge to her cheeks, the glassy sheen in her eyes, and her inability to stand still painted a portrait of a woman long since detached from sobriety. When McGonagall arrives to assist her, even she hesitates before embracing Trelawney's hysteria, as if knowing this wasn't merely the reaction of a wronged teacher, it was the breakdown of someone who had been unravelling in slow motion. Divination, as a subject, demanded clarity of mind and spiritual balance. Yet Sybil's mind was rarely clear. Students whispered about the bottles hidden under the tasselled tables. Lavender Brown once giggled after class, claiming she had spotted a tiny silver flask poking from the professor's voluminous sleeve. Parvati Patil nervously hushed her, yet even she couldn't deny the scent that often clung to the room like a ghost. Sherry, perhaps, or something stronger. The aroma was not just perfume and incense, it had an unmistakable burn. It's difficult to reconcile the image of a Hogwarts professor indulging in alcohol during school hours, but with Sybil Trelawney, such a conclusion begins to feel less speculative and more inevitable. Even Dumbledore, a man known for his compassion and patience, placed her in a tower removed from the rest of the castle, like a secret to be hidden high above the common eye. He protected her position, certainly, but it's not hard to wonder if he also isolated her to contain the damage, to keep her drinking from seeping into the foundations of the school. In Half-Blood Prince, there is another moment that speaks volumes. Trelawney is once again wandering the halls, this time suspiciously anxious about her room being taken. When Harry crosses paths with her, she's muttering about the room of requirement. "I often come here when I wish to compose myself," she says. Yet her words lack the dignity of reflection. She seems confused, nearly disoriented. Her hands fumble. She reeks of spirits. When she reveals she had been throwing away her empty sherry bottles, the truth is no longer whispered, it's confirmed. "There was a room," she says, "a room I had never seen before, filled with bottles." A chilling confession that could so easily be brushed aside as quirky behaviour, but instead reveals a routine of drinking that had become so normalised to her that she considered it part of her process of composure. These aren't mere accidents or one-time slips. These are patterns visible to the students, to her colleagues, and likely to herself. The problem is that Hogwarts, for all its brilliance, often chose to look away when eccentricity tipped into dysfunction. Trelawney's predictions of doom became a running joke. Her odd speech, her tremors, Her tendency to retreat into the shadows, these were all signs, but they were mistaken for personality quirks. Professor McGonagall once remarked that Trelawney had predicted the death of one student a week since the beginning of term. It was said in jest, but what if this compulsive forecasting of disaster was not just an act to impress young minds, but the product of a fogged, intoxicated state? Alcohol, after all, doesn't only blur speech and vision, it warps judgment, heightens paranoia, and often increases fixation. Her obsession with predicting death could easily have been alcohol-fueled dramatics and not mystical insight. The darker interpretation is that she had become addicted to the attention such predictions brought, and the drink helped fuel that dependency. A school such as Hogwarts holds a heavy responsibility. Children as young as 11 walk those halls, trusting their professors not just with their academic growth, but with their emotional safety. Trelawney, in her altered state, violated that trust, even if unintentionally. It was not a crime of cruelty, but of neglect of her own health, of her students' respect, and of the sacred duty she once held. Imagine a potions class taught by someone under the influence. What horrors could emerge? Yet divination, though more abstract, was no less delicate. What makes her case more troubling is the way the administration handled it, or didn't. Dumbledore knew, he always knew. His piercing intelligence and unmatched intuition would not have missed the stench of sherry, the slurred words, the shaken nerves. He defended her position multiple times, even against Umbridge. But was it truly kindness, or a form of denial? Perhaps even Dumbledore, with all his wisdom, could not bear to abandon a woman who once, in the haze of prophecy, had given him the key to understanding Voldemort's fall. That prophecy, the one made in the Hog's head, is the cruel irony of Sybil Trelawney's story. It was real, it mattered, but it was also made during a night in a pub, under mysterious conditions and witnessed only by Snape. Was it coincidence that her one true act of prophecy occurred in a place of drink and shadow? Or does it reflect something more sinister, that even in her rarest moment of true vision, she was not sober? This dependence had roots deeper than Hogwarts. Sybil was the great-great-granddaughter of the celebrated seer Cassandra Trelawney, a woman of real vision and fame. Living in that shadow must have been unbearable. To be born with the name but not the gift, to know that her employment was likely charity and her lessons a performance. The pressure to be a true seer might have driven her to find comfort in the bottle. Not every addiction is born from vice, some grow from desperation. The students, of course, never saw it this way. They chuckled, they rolled their eyes. Even Hermione, usually sensitive to injustice, showed no patience for Trelawney, declaring divination a very woolly discipline. But perhaps Hermione sensed the deeper truth, that what was being taught wasn't divination, but the illusion of it, propped up by inebriation and veiled in incense. Hermione walked out of that class not because she hated prophecy, but because she hated dishonesty. Sybil's decline didn't happen all at once. It happened in teaspoons and sherry glasses, in long afternoons spent alone in her tower, pouring another drink when no students came to her consultations, in silent dinners in the great hall where no one sat beside her, in the sniggers of Slytherins and the indifference of Gryffindors. She drank, perhaps, to silence the humiliation, to blur the image of herself reflected in the eyes of others. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when something like clarity shone through her. In The Prisoner of Azkaban she delivers a chilling prophecy in a trance, her voice different, her presence transformed. "The Dark Lord lies alone and friendless," she intones, "abandoned by his followers. His servant has been chained these 12 years. This moment is real. Harry sees it. We see it. The tragedy is that even in these moments of truth, Sybil would not remember what she had said. She wasn't drunk, but she might as well have been. Detached from her own gift, incapable of wielding it with awareness. If Hogwarts was a tapestry of magical brilliance. Trelawney was a fraying thread, beautiful in her complexity, tragic in her fragility. She was not evil, she was not even dangerous, not in the way others were, but she was broken, and that brokenness went unchecked. The true shame of it lies not in her drunken stumbles through the halls, but in the fact that no one truly helped her stand again. Not her peers, not her students, not even herself. She remains at Hogwarts even after the war, her presence largely ceremonial. The new generation of students no longer laughs as loudly. The castle is filled with ghosts, both literal and emotional, and Trelawney, with her clinking bottles and fading voice, is one of them. Not quite a teacher, not quite a seer, just a woman with dreams too heavy to carry and visions too real to forget. In the end, Sybil Trelawney is a lesson Hogwarts never intended to teach, that even in a world of magic, some wounds cannot be healed by charms, that the mind, like a fragile mirror, can shatter quietly, and that sometimes the ones predicting doom are the ones most in need of saving. Number 20, Sybil Trelawney and Firenze turned divination into a personal feud. When Sybil Trelawney was unceremoniously dismissed from her post at Hogwarts by Dolores Umbridge, in Order of the Phoenix, it sent shockwaves through the castle. Trelawney, with her heavy perfume and tinkling bangles, had always been a controversial figure, but her removal was more than just a staffing change. It was the beginning of a deeper fracture within the divination department. When the centaur Firenze was brought in as her replacement, students first assumed the arrangement was temporary, but when Trelawney was later reinstated by Dumbledore without removing Firenze, a curious situation emerged. Two professors now laid claim to the same subject, and neither was willing to yield. Firenze taught his classes in a transformed classroom deep within the castle, the floor covered in moss and pine needles, the ceiling enchanted to resemble the night sky. He used celestial alignments, ancient symbols, and the instincts of his kind to predict fate. Sybil, on the other hand, resumed her post at the top of the North Tower, nestled in drapery and smoke, where crystal balls and tarot cards guided her mystic utterings. The problem was not that both taught divination, it was that they disapproved entirely of each other's methods and made no secret of it. Students were split. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil remained loyal to Trelawney, claiming her visions carried an emotional truth that Firenze's cold astronomy lacked. Meanwhile, Dean Thomas and even Hermione Granger, though sceptical of divination in general, voiced respect for the centaur's rationality. What emerged wasn't a healthy academic debate, but a silent battleground where students bore the brunt of two adults' bruised egos. It wasn't just a difference in method. Sybil often made cryptic comments about those who cannot grasp the inner eye and referred to centaurs as creatures of the forest, however noble. She once told a group of fifth years that some beings can see stars but not truth, a comment Lavender repeated in the Great Hall, earning gasps and whispers. Firenze, ever composed, would tell his students, "The future is written in the heavens, not in the fumes of sherry," a remark that made Seamus choke on his pumpkin juice. The effect was corrosive. Students who had classes with both were often subjected to direct contradictions. One week, Trelawney declared that Mars was in a dominant position, heralding conflict, and warned Ron Weasley of a coming betrayal. In Firenze's class the next day, he calmly stated that Mars was in retrograde, and its influence had no meaning in the face of recent cosmic balances. Ron was bewildered, and not for the first time. "How can two teachers say the opposite and both be right?" he asked Harry, in exasperation. Tensions reached a peak when Sybil learned that Firenze had assigned an essay debunking palmistry. She retaliated with a lecture on the arrogance of those who believe they are above symbols, then dramatically predicted a forest-born being would suffer a loss of purpose under the weight of arrogance. Parvati wrote the line down in her notebook, whispering to Lavender that Sybil clearly meant Firenze. Word spread quickly, and by the next week, Firenze had removed palmistry from the syllabus entirely, replacing it with a night observation of Orion's belt. "The stars are not petty," he said, "and they do not gossip." The students began to take sides more aggressively. Those who favoured Firenze mocked Trelawney's predictions under their breath, while her supporters rolled their eyes during centaur lectures. Ginny Weasley, who had no particular preference, noted that neither teacher seemed to care how the students felt. "It's like we're pawns in their little grudge match," she muttered to Luna Lovegood, who only nodded serenely, claiming she'd seen a rackspurt feeding on Sybil's insecurity. A particularly cruel moment came during a sixth-year NEWT preparation class. Trelawney had told Neville Longbottom that his inner clarity suggested he might have the sight, and encouraged him to practice tea-leaf readings. Firenze, the next day, instructed the same class that clinging to illusions of sight blinds true insight, casting a glance at Neville's crumpled teacup and making the poor boy shrink into his seat. "It's not just confusing," he whispered later to Hermione. "It feels like they're using us to insult each other." Even Dumbledore seemed unsure how to handle the situation. He was famously tolerant of eccentricity and reluctant to interfere with teaching styles. Yet Minerva McGonagall was overheard muttering to Professor Flitwick, "If divination was questionable before, it's a circus now." Despite the headmaster's fondness for Trelawney and his compassion for Firenze's exile from his herd, allowing both to teach the same subject without coordination had created a fractured learning environment. The most damaging aspect, perhaps, was the erosion of the subject's credibility. Divination had always been seen as a soft subject, even a joke, by many in the staff. Professor McGonagall had once told Harry true seers are extremely rare, and she clearly didn't count Trelawney among them. But now, with two teachers at war, students no longer questioned whether predictions were true. They questioned whether divination itself was anything more than performance. One particularly telling moment came when Harry was assigned a dream journal by both teachers. Trelawney asked for symbolic interpretations, while Firenze wanted astrological alignments with lunar shifts. When Harry submitted both versions, each teacher graded the other's preferred format harshly. Trelawney called his lunar notes soulless, while Firenze wrote, "No meaningful insight detected in symbolic meandering." Harry gave up trying and submitted blank pages the next week. Neither teacher noticed. In Half-Blood Prince, when the castle was gripped by fear and uncertainty, Trelawney became more erratic. She was often found muttering to herself in the corridors, smelling strongly of cooking sherry and whispering about dark clouds around the young ones. Firenze, meanwhile, kept calm, teaching constellations with the grace of one who'd seen centuries pass. But even he wasn't immune to subtle digs. He once remarked that emotion clouds prophecy, which was a veiled reference to Sybil's often dramatic delivery. The situation might have passed as a harmless quirk of Hogwarts life had it not influenced the students so deeply. Several students began mimicking the feud in their own lives. Lavender and Dean had a heated argument about the validity of dream symbology versus star charts during a study session, resulting in Lavender refusing to share notes. "It's not just about class," Hermione told Harry once. "It's about how authority figures shape how we treat knowledge and each other." The most alarming incident came shortly before the Battle of Hogwarts. During a combined divination workshop forced by Professor Slughorn in an effort to promote unity, the two teachers stood on opposite ends of the astronomy tower, each interpreting a meteor shower differently. Firenze spoke first, describing a great shift in the tides of power, while Trelawney declared a hidden death cloaked in disguise. Their voices rose in tension, and the students grew visibly uncomfortable. When Draco Malfoy snidely asked which of them would be proven wrong first, neither replied. It was Luna Lovegood, in her quiet, dreamlike voice, who finally addressed what no one else would. "Maybe both of them are right," she said, "and maybe they're both wrong. Prophecy isn't about being loudest, it's about listening." Her words, though soft, silenced the room. For a moment, even Sybil paused. Still, the damage had been done. Years later, former students like Neville Longbottom and Hannah Abbott would recall divination as the most stressful subject, not because of its content, but because of the tension. The subject that should have explored mystery, fate, and introspection had become a battleground for ego. In the end, the so-called duel between Sybil Trelawney and Firenze never resulted in open confrontation, but its scars were left on those who passed through their classrooms. The conflict highlighted something deeper than method. It exposed how personal wounds, professional insecurity, and pride can eclipse the very purpose of education. In the corridors of Hogwarts, where portraits whisper and ghosts pass silently, students carried not just books, but the burdens their professors handed them. Number 21, Severus Snape, publicly humiliated Neville Longbottom. In the dungeons of Hogwarts, where shadows clung to every wall and cauldron, there existed a classroom where fear outweighed education. Professor Severus Snape, master of potions, presided over this place not as a mentor, but as a looming presence who demanded more than academic excellence. He demanded submission. For some students, this intimidation merely became part of the ambience of their magical education. For others, it left deeper scars. One such student was Neville Longbottom, a boy often dismissed as forgetful and clumsy, but who in reality bore silent burdens heavier than most could guess. Snape, rather than offering this child guidance, became an architect of his terror. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Neville's very first year at Hogwarts, his dread of potions class is not just hinted at, it is painfully evident. Rowling writes, Neville, who had somehow managed to melt Seamus's cauldron into a twisted blob, was being drenched in a boiling potion and was trying to hold back tears as Snape started berating him. The words don't describe a firm teacher correcting a mistake. They reveal a man unleashing fury upon a child too scared to meet his gaze. Instead of shielding Neville from further embarrassment, Snape announces the mistake to the entire class, drawing scorn and amusement from his peers. Here was a professor who wielded his authority not as a means to educate, but as a weapon to degrade. Snape's disdain for Neville was not limited to outbursts. It was systematic. Lesson after lesson he singled him out, rarely missing a chance to mock his failures. In a profession that requires precision and self-belief, Neville's trembling hands and fearful glances were not met with encouragement but contempt. Every mistake, no matter how minor, was spotlighted. When Neville incorrectly added a porcupine quill to a potion while it was still boiling, causing an explosion, Snape seized the moment to belittle him. "Why didn't you add the quills after taking the cauldron off the fire? Thought they'd do better boiling, did you?" The tone in the book is unmistakable. Snape knew he was dealing with a child who feared him, and he leaned into that fear. To the outside eye, Snape might be interpreted as an exacting teacher pushing students to their limits, but in Neville's case, this argument doesn't hold. The line between strictness and cruelty is crossed the moment a teacher stops trying to uplift and begins to humiliate. Neville didn't grow under Snape's instruction, he withered. He was not a student who failed to try. Rather, he tried so hard and feared so deeply that it impeded him. A good teacher would have seen this, adjusted their approach. Snape saw it, and he exploited it. There is a moment in Prisoner of Azkaban when Lupin introduces a boggart in a defense against the dark arts class, asking students to confront their greatest fears. For most, the boggart turns into spiders, ghosts, or failing exams. But for Neville, the thing he fears most takes on the shape of Professor Snape. When a child imagines their teacher as their worst nightmare, it speaks volumes, not about the child, but the teacher. Lupin, in a moment of compassion, helps Neville defeat the boggart by encouraging him to imagine Snape in his grandmother's clothes. The class laughs, but the image stays with the reader, not because it is amusing, but because it highlights how deeply Snape's presence terrorized this one student. This was not an isolated incident. In Philosopher's Stone, when Snape first meets the first years in the dungeon, he doesn't begin the class with a welcoming tone or an introduction to the art of potion-making. He begins with condescension. "I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, and even put a stopper in death," he says, and the line drips with dramatic self-importance. Then, as if seeking a target, he lands on Harry Potter, and not long after begins using Neville as a scapegoat. The issue is not that Snape demanded excellence, it's that he had no patience for vulnerability. And Neville embodied vulnerability in every movement. When Neville accidentally breaks his wrist during flying lessons, the aftermath in the hospital wing is quickly overshadowed by Snape docking Gryffindor points, because Longbottom has been sent to the hospital wing. This moment, while not even in Snape's class, reveals the depth of his disdain. It wasn't about academic failure anymore. It was personal. Snape didn't just want to correct Neville, he wanted to penalize him for existing in a way that displeased him. One might argue that Snape's own past, riddled with pain, betrayal, and trauma, colored the way he viewed students like Neville, those who were not strong, not sharp-tongued, not self-assured. But teaching is not therapy. A professor must be responsible for their students' emotional development as much as their academic growth. Snape, instead of confronting his demons, seemed to channel them into targeted disdain. For Neville, this meant not just fear of failing a potion, but of entering the classroom at all. In Chamber of Secrets, during another potions class, Neville's potion turns orange instead of green, and the result causes boils to sprout on his skin. Instead of helping him or showing concern, Snape coldly says, "Idiot boy, I suppose you added the porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire?" The lack of empathy in this line is telling. The phrase "idiot boy" is more than an insult, it's a label. A teacher's words have the power to define how a student sees themselves. For a child already struggling with confidence, being called an idiot by an authority figure only solidifies the self-doubt. Neville was also among the students most frequently penalized with point deductions and detentions. This created a damaging cycle. He feared the class, his fear caused mistakes, the mistakes were punished, and the punishments reinforced the fear. Even other professors noticed Neville's nervousness in potions. In Order of the Phoenix, Professor McGonagall tells Harry, "Why is it always you three?" referring to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. But when Neville is present, she takes a different tone. She sees him as fragile and often tries to bolster him. It's a sharp contrast to Snape's approach. While McGonagall is strict, she is never cruel. What makes Snape's behavior even more unsettling is the contrast with how he treated other students, notably those from Slytherin House. Draco Malfoy, who frequently insulted other students and showed arrogance, was rarely on the receiving end of Snape's wrath. In fact, Draco's mistakes in potions were often overlooked or dismissed with minor corrections. This favoritism didn't go unnoticed. Gryffindors knew they were under a different standard, and Neville, being the weakest among them, bore the brunt. Some fans have tried to excuse Snape's behavior by highlighting his ultimate heroism, that he protected Harry, that he worked as a double agent, that he sacrificed much for the greater good. But noble actions in war do not excuse cruelty in peace. Snape's bullying of Neville was not a necessary evil. It served no higher purpose. It didn't build character or inspire greatness. If anything, it nearly crushed the spirit of a boy who had already lost his parents to unspeakable horrors. It is important to remember that Neville Longbottom was not just a forgetful child. He was the son of Auros Frank and Alice Longbottom, both of whom had been tortured into insanity by Bellatrix Lestrange. Raised by his strict grandmother, constantly compared to his courageous parents, and already struggling with his magical self-worth, Neville entered Hogwarts with wounds invisible to the eye. A compassionate teacher might have seen the signs. A wise one might have nurtured him. Snape did neither. When Snape confronted a student like Hermione, who was academically gifted and outspoken, his insults took the shape of jealousy and bitterness, calling her an insufferable know-it-all. But when he confronted Neville, the attacks weren't witty or intellectual, they were brutal, they were cheap shots, and they came not from a place of rivalry, but from a place of superiority. Neville couldn't fight back, he couldn't talk back, and so Snape made him the perfect target. The most heartbreaking part is that Neville never harboured hatred for Snape. He feared him, yes. He avoided him, certainly. But he didn't retaliate or speak ill of him, even when given the chance. Neville's quiet endurance was never met with recognition. His growth into a courageous leader in Deathly Hallows, standing up to the Carrows, drawing the sword of Gryffindor, slaying Nagini, was a triumph not because of Snape's teachings, but in spite of them. One of the greatest tragedies of Snape's story is that he had moments where he could have chosen kindness. He understood pain. He knew what it meant to be the outcast, the underdog. And yet when he saw a boy just like that sitting in front of him in class, he did not extend a hand. He twisted the knife. The very empathy Snape might have hoped for as a child was something he refused to give when he became an adult. Even in Half-Blood Prince, when Snape begins to play a larger role in the unfolding war, he does not soften toward Neville. The bias remains. The cold remarks continue. The opportunity for redemption in their relationship never materializes. Snape's complexity as a character does not erase the pain he caused along the way. And for Neville, that pain was formative. It delayed his potential, shook his confidence, and made every potions class a chamber of dread. Snape's legacy is not black or white. It is shaded in grey, acts of valour wrapped in layers of cruelty. But when it comes to his treatment of Neville Longbottom, the grey fades. What remains is a stark and simple truth. He bullied a child who needed a teacher. And no revelation, no sacrifice, no hero's end can change what that child endured under his gaze. Number 22. Horace Slughorn created an elitist club and ignored other students. Of all the teachers to ever grace the halls of Hogwarts, none was more paradoxical than Horace Slughorn. A man of immense charm, polished manners, and genteel sophistication, Slughorn held an outward appearance of harmless eccentricity. He favoured crystallized pineapple, wore velvet slippers, and entertained guests in rooms thick with perfume and plum-coloured upholstery. But behind this rich facade lurked a subtle form of favouritism that carved invisible lines through Hogwarts' student body. His Slug Club, a collection of carefully chosen pupils, was a social circle disguised as mentorship. Its exclusivity reflected not just personal taste, but a quiet systemic endorsement of privilege, status, and pedigree. Slughorn's method of selection was always strategic. He preferred the brilliant, the bold, or those born into fame. Notably, he fawned over the likes of Tom Riddle, long before the name became a whisper of dread. He admired Riddle's charisma, intelligence, and orphanage-defying charm, never seeing the darkness blooming behind his polished manners. The damage began there, a professor enchanted by prestige, blind to character. When Slughorn first invited Tom to one of his gatherings, he wasn't nurturing potential so much as amplifying the dangerous. He was a charming boy, Slughorn once recalled. I used to tell him he could have been Minister of Magic. And indeed the charm was real, but the professor had looked only at what glittered, not at what simmered beneath. The Slug Club was not merely an academic initiative, it was a network, a hidden corridor through which future leaders, celebrities and socialites passed and exchanged nods of recognition. Ginny Weasley was only invited after catching the eye of Harry Potter during a Quidditch match. Hermione Granger was welcomed for her astounding intellect, but even she recognized the underlying code. It was never entirely about merit. It was about merit wrapped in potential influence. Those who lacked family ties, social prestige, or magnetic charm remained outside the circle, their achievements invisible to Slughorn's selective gaze. This selective mentorship was never formally condemned, yet it quietly undermined the very foundation of what Hogwarts claimed to be, a place where every magical child, regardless of birth, could rise. When Neville Longbottom stumbled in class or failed to impress with flashy spells, he was overlooked, not out of malice, but because Slughorn saw no reflection of power or promise. And yet in the end, Neville would prove to be among the bravest of them all. That Slughorn never spotted the courage in him spoke volumes. It wasn't ability Slughorn prized, it was the shimmer of legacy, the proximity to greatness, real or imagined. There was a moment during Harry's 6th year that revealed the core of Slughorn's values. When Harry produced the Bezoar to save Ron from poisoning at a dinner party, it wasn't Ron's life that dominated the professor's thoughts. It was the spectacle of Harry's knowledge. Slughorn beamed. He offered compliments and sweetmeats, but not once did he reflect on why Ron had not received similar care and attention before. Ron, always loyal and brave, sat in Harry's shadow. Slughorn never noticed. It wasn't enough to be good, one had to be visible, connected, or potentially useful. Even Draco Malfoy received Slughorn's attention, not because of stellar academic work, but because of the Malfoy name. Despite the whispers surrounding Lucius Malfoy and his alignment with the dark, the prestige of the family remained a currency Slughorn would not resist. In a world where children of Death Eaters still had access to elite treatment, one begins to question the neutrality of education at Hogwarts. Slughorn's affability masked this bias well, but it festered beneath the surface, leaving many students to wonder what determined their worth. Luna Lovegood, eccentric and wise beyond her years, was never invited to a Slug Club meeting. Her insights, while often cloaked in metaphor, revealed an intelligence most teachers failed to appreciate. But Luna was different. Too odd, too unpredictable. Her father, Xenophilius Lovegood, published the unconventional Quibbler, not the kind of association Slughorn deemed valuable. And so Luna remained on the fringes. No velvet invitations, no pumpkin fizz in the professor's drawing room. Slughorn never realized the price of exclusion, the weight of silence, the message it sent to every other ordinary student walking the castle halls. Even Harry Potter, Slughorn's shining trophy, was not immune to the subtle transactions of favour. Slughorn sought his company not for who Harry was, but for who his mother had been. "I taught the whole Potter family, you know," he would say, with exaggerated nostalgia. And when he finally yielded the memory of the Horcrux to Harry, it was not because of love or duty, it was because Harry had played the game. He had flattered, enticed, and offered Slughorn the promise of legacy. Slughorn feared judgment, not consequence. His conscience stirred only when it threatened his reputation in the eyes of posterity. Such favoritism was a quiet poison. It taught students to seek validation through association. It taught them that success was not always earned. It was sometimes bestowed. Slughorn's club gave legitimacy to the idea that connections were more valuable than courage and bloodlines more potent than originality. And the most dangerous part? He did it with a smile. There was no grand announcement, no decree of superiority. Just soft music, rich food, and carefully curated guest lists. In his own way, Slughorn embodied the very elitism that Slytherin House is so often accused of. But unlike the overt pride of someone like Snape or the cold ambition of Lucius Malfoy, Slughorn's biases came wrapped in good intentions. He believed he was helping. He saw himself as a gardener, nurturing the seeds of greatness, but he watered only the flowers that bloomed quickly and smelled sweet. The rest he left to the shadows. During the Battle of Hogwarts, when students stood side by side, Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and even Slytherin, the illusion of hierarchy collapsed. Slughorn, to his credit, fought bravely, but his years of subtle segregation had already left a mark. The unity forged in that moment of crisis could not undo the years of silent division. One wonders how many brilliant minds went unnoticed, how many friendships were never formed because a professor had decided someone was unremarkable. There's a chilling irony in the fact that Slughorn feared Tom Riddle's rise to power, but never questioned his role in nurturing it. He hadn't created Voldemort, no, but he had offered him a stage, a platform, a whisper of legitimacy. Tom knew how to charm those who valued potential. Slughorn saw only what he wanted to see, and in that blindness he contributed, however unknowingly, to a future soaked in blood and horror. His guilt over the Horcrux memory was real. It aged him, haunted him. He drank to forget, moved from house to house. And yet, when Dumbledore found him, Slughorn still needed to be convinced. Not by principle, but by persuasion. He did not return to Hogwarts because of duty. He returned because the right person asked. When we look at Horace Slughorn, we see the dangerous middle ground of morality. He was no villain. He was kind, witty, generous in his own way, but his decisions built invisible walls around children. He defined value by lineage, charisma, and charm. And in doing so, he taught the next generation that worth could be inherited or performed, but not always earned. Perhaps the most telling moment came not in a classroom, but in the way students whispered about the Slug Club. Some aspired to it, others scorned it, but none could ignore it. It was a symbol, a key that unlocked future doors, and the ones without keys, they were left to wander the long corridors alone, wondering what they lacked. Had Slughorn invested equally in all his students, he might have discovered future heroes in unexpected places. He might have seen the wisdom in Luna, the courage in Neville, the silent loyalty in students like Susan Bones or Dean Thomas. Instead, he followed the bright lights, forgetting that stars are not the only things that shine in darkness. He once said, "You are like your mother, bold, fierce, and bright." But it wasn't Harry's similarity to Lily that made him great. It was his choices. The same choices Slughorn avoided for so long, choices that required principle over pleasure, courage over comfort. Slughorn never fully understood that. In the end, Horace Slughorn was a man who meant well, but looked through the wrong lens. His actions were never loud, but they were loud enough for those left behind. The damage he caused wasn't in curses or cruelty, but in silence, in laughter that excluded, in doors that never opened. At Hogwarts, the greatest magic was meant to be the transformation of potential into reality. But Slughorn's magic was selective. He believed in talent, but only the kind he could recognize. And in a world like theirs, that was more dangerous than any spell. Number 23, Sybil Trelawney, refused to teach skeptics like Hermione. Professor Sybil Trelawney sat in her tower room, cloaked in swirling incense and draped fabrics, always half-shrouded in shadows, but her true nature had long ceased to be a mystery to the more discerning students at Hogwarts. She did not merely teach divination, she lived it with such theatrical flair that it often felt less like education and more like a séance. Yet the most troubling part of her tenure was not the questionable legitimacy of her predictions, but her troubling treatment of students who dared to doubt her. Chief among them was Hermione Granger, a Muggle-born genius who represented logic, evidence, and clear thinking, everything Sybil seemed to resist with quiet hostility. It began subtly, like all moral slips do. When Hermione first sat in the low, perfumed classroom for her first divination lesson, her sharp mind was already skeptical. She had read enough about the subject to know that even within the wizarding world, divination was viewed with suspicion. Professor McGonagall herself once said, "True seers are very rare, Hermione." But rather than embracing the challenge of teaching a brilliant skeptic, Trelawney recoiled, her pride stung by the student's questioning nature. She didn't try to win Hermione over with compelling insights or demonstrate the power of her subject. Instead, she belittled, ignored, and eventually expelled her, not from the classroom, but from the culture of belief Trelawney demanded from all her students. Hermione's first act of doubt came after Trelawney predicted the death of a student. "I sense something dark, the omen of death," she declared, theatrically collapsing into her chair. The class froze in terror until Hermione muttered, not loudly but firmly enough, "Honestly, that's what she said about Neville last week." Trelawney's eyes narrowed behind her enormous spectacles, and from that moment Hermione became not just a student, but a threat to her authority. It was a line Sybil could not forgive, not because it was rude, but because it exposed the frailty behind her performance. Trelawney began to isolate her. She never called on Hermione for answers, never acknowledged her presence unless to correct her tone. When other students were praised for vague observations, Hermione's accurate but skeptical comments were ignored or twisted. During tea leaf readings, when Hermione pointed out the lack of consistency in their interpretations, Trelawney offered a thin smile and remarked, "Some minds are just too tightly bound to see." She said it to the room, not to Hermione directly, but everyone understood who it was meant for. These passive-aggressive remarks became routine, a form of punishment dressed in mysticism. The turning point came during the crystal ball unit. As the students stared into misty glass orbs, desperately trying to see visions, Hermione dared to question the process. "I see absolutely nothing," she said flatly. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil gasped, but Trelawney merely waved a ring-covered hand and said, "There is no seeing for the unseeing." It was not a moment of teaching, it was rejection. Hermione didn't need to be expelled. She was being pushed out, lesson by lesson, until she finally stood up one day and left, slamming the trapdoor behind her. Trelawney didn't even flinch. She simply turned to the class and sighed. It happens sometimes. The energy was never right with that one. This was not just passive indifference. Trelawney had made an active choice. She would not teach those who did not worship her methods. In a school as celebrated as Hogwarts, this was a disturbing precedent. Education should have been about expansion, reaching students with different minds, not just echoing one's own. But Trelawney, shrouded in scented scarves and ego, had no place for those who refused to bow before her brand of magic. Other professors noticed, though few intervened. McGonagall, with her cool pragmatism, once told Hermione that Trelawney had predicted the death of one student per term since she arrived. The comment was meant to soothe Hermione, but it revealed a pattern of manipulation. Sybil's authority came not from her wisdom, but from the fear she injected into her students. It was a fear-based classroom where loyalty was awarded and doubt punished. In any Muggle school, this would be cause for investigation, perhaps even termination. But at Hogwarts, the boundaries between eccentricity and misconduct blurred too easily, particularly when cloaked in ancient magic. Trelawney's behavior could be excused, perhaps, if her cruelty came from truth, but the irony was bitter. Sybil had made only 2 real prophecies in her life, and neither had been remembered by her. The rest were theatre, dramatic gasps, clutching of pearls, and predictions that crumbled under scrutiny. And when scrutiny came, as it did with Hermione, her entire system collapsed. A teacher, secure in her truth, might have embraced Hermione, challenged her, invited her to test and learn. But Trelawney was not secure, she was fragile, and her fragility was disguised as spiritual superiority. There is a moment, preserved in Prisoner of Azkaban, that perfectly illustrates this. During one lesson, after Hermione questions her methods again, Trelawney breathes deeply and declares, "You may be young in years, but the heart that beats beneath your bosom is as shriveled as an old maid's." It's a cutting statement, one meant to wound, not teach. There was no lesson in that insult, only cruelty dressed in silk. The implications for Hermione were deep. Here was a brilliant student, already under pressure to prove herself in a world that distrusted her bloodline, being ridiculed for using her mind. Trelawney did not just dismiss her, she tried to shame her for her intelligence. And though Hermione recovered, the damage was clear. She dropped the class, and with it, any opportunity to learn from divination in an academic way. Who knows what might have happened if she had stayed? Could she have found something useful in its symbols? Could divination have grown stronger with someone like Hermione contributing to its method? We will never know, because the teacher had no room for doubt. What makes Trelawney's behavior especially concerning is the hierarchy it created. Students like Lavender and Parvati, who nodded enthusiastically and repeated her phrases, were rewarded with warmth. Trelawney would coo over their sight and whisper encouragement. But these weren't real discoveries. They were rehearsals of her own vocabulary. It was the echo chamber of a teacher afraid to be challenged. In such a space, students don't grow. They shrink into caricatures of their teacher, losing the critical thinking that education is meant to inspire. This is not merely a tale of one bad teacher, it's a cautionary portrait of how authority can twist under pressure. Trelawney was never evil, but she was insecure, and in her insecurity she targeted the one student who might have helped her grow. Hermione represented the new world, one that demanded clarity, evidence, and mutual respect. Trelawney, stuck in her tapestries and trembling visions, chose to mock that world instead of rising to meet it. And the system allowed it. Dumbledore, kind but often detached, kept Trelawney at Hogwarts not for her teaching, but because of the one real prophecy she had delivered about Harry Potter. It was a political decision, not a pedagogical one. He protected her, not because she was effective, but because she was necessary. This left students like Hermione unprotected from her disdain. In a sense, Hermione wasn't just failed by a professor, she was failed by the institution that permitted it. The great tragedy is that Trelawney never saw her own potential. Beneath the layers of mysticism was a woman who had, in rare moments, touched something true. Her prophecy about the Dark Lord, made in a trance she didn't remember, had altered the fate of the wizarding world. But instead of treating that moment with humility, she clung to it like a shield, wielding it against anyone who doubted her. Rather than rising to the level of that one moment, she sank into its shadow. Hermione's experience is also a lesson in resilience. She did not shout or seek revenge, she simply left. She chose subjects that valued her mind, found mentors who saw her potential, and went on to become one of the most capable witches of her time. But the fact that she had to walk away to grow, that she was expelled not by a rule, but by an attitude, should trouble anyone who believes in the power of education. One cannot forget the silent students in that class, the ones who saw Hermione's struggle but said nothing. How many of them were quietly skeptical too? How many stayed quiet, fearing the same treatment? When education becomes a cult of personality, doubt becomes danger. And when doubt is punished, learning dies. Even years later, as readers revisit those scenes, the discomfort remains. Not because Trelawney was a villain, but because she was something far more real, a flawed teacher with too much power and too little self-awareness. She believed in prophecy, but never saw the one truth before her, that doubt is not the enemy of magic. It is the beginning of understanding. Sybil Trelawney remains one of the most fascinating characters in the Harry Potter universe, not for her gifts, but for what she lacked. She lacked the courage to teach those who challenged her, and in doing so she robbed both herself and her students of the chance to grow. There was magic in her tower, but it was trapped in mirrors, bouncing back only her own reflection. Her legacy is not just the prophecy about the chosen one, it is also the silence that fell after Hermione left the room. It is the way she curled into herself rather than reaching outward. It is a reminder that true magic, like true teaching, thrives in the presence of doubt, and those who cannot embrace that truth may see visions, but they will never see growth. Number 24, Rubeus Hagrid, gifted. Harry a dangerously aggressive hippogriff. Of all the oddities Hogwarts has witnessed over the centuries, few raised more silent eyebrows than the decision to entrust the newly appointed care of magical creatures post to Rubeus Hagrid. An undeniably kind soul with a heart beating for the misunderstood, Hagrid's love for magical beasts was no secret. Yet love alone does not always guarantee sound judgment, especially when it comes to safeguarding young witches and wizards still learning to harness their own powers. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, J.K. Rowling paints an enchanting, even majestic picture as Harry Potter soars over the lake on the back of Buckbeak, a proud and temperamental hippogriff. It is a scene of liberation, of youthful awe and cinematic grace. But behind the veil of enchantment lurks a deeply questionable decision, one that placed children in real danger and nearly condemned an innocent creature to death. The lesson in question begins with a flourish. Hagrid, radiating enthusiasm, unveils Buckbeak before a class of third-year students. Hippogriffs, as described in The Monster Book of Monsters, are large winged creatures with the front half of a giant eagle and the hindquarters of a horse. Fiercely proud, they demand respect and proper etiquette from any human wishing to approach. "You've got to bow," Hagrid instructs. "You've got to wait for him to bow back." The implications of disobedience or miscommunication are grim. The risk is not theoretical. Hippogriffs are fast, strong, and have razor-sharp talons capable of slicing flesh with ease. In truth, they are not pets, they are wild. When Harry succeeds in approaching Buckbeak and eventually takes to the skies, the moment is described with romantic awe. "It was better than a broomstick," the narrative insists, as the wind screams in Harry's ears and the castle falls away beneath him. But what if it hadn't gone so well? What if Harry had sneezed or bowed improperly? What if Buckbeak had taken offense at the sudden rush of adrenaline? Hagrid was gambling with more than a lesson plan. He was playing with the laws of probability, betting that a classroom full of children could instinctively navigate the fragile pride of a dangerous animal. Draco Malfoy's encounter with Buckbeak is the price of that gamble. Arrogant and careless, Malfoy steps forward with barely concealed contempt and a sneer curling his lip. He does not bow properly. He ignores Hagrid's warning and struts as if no creature, magical or mundane, could dare challenge the heir of the Malfoy name. Buckbeak, insulted, lashes out with astonishing speed, striking Draco and sending him to the hospital wing. The injury is not fatal, but it is serious enough to cause panic, and not just for Draco. The entire chain of events that follows casts a dark shadow on what was meant to be a triumphant debut for Hagrid's teaching career. Lucius Malfoy, ever eager to pounce on perceived slights and weaknesses, seizes the moment. Using his influence within the Ministry of Magic and the Board of Governors, he demands that Buckbeak be executed. Suddenly the story is no longer about a boy's minor injury. It becomes a matter of public safety, institutional oversight, and political optics. And Hagrid, the gentle giant with his heart forever tied to the fates of beasts, is devastated. "He's not dangerous," he insists, tears in his eyes. "It wasn't Buckbeak's fault." But intentions are not the same as consequences. For all Hagrid's goodwill, he had introduced a volatile creature to children without any real safeguard beyond etiquette. The magical world is not a place devoid of risk. On the contrary, danger lurks in potions, in duels, in the forbidden forest. But there is a difference between risk that is managed and risk that is blindly romanticized. In the case of Buckbeak, Hagrid's decision prioritized emotional connection over pedagogical foresight. The result was near catastrophic. Even Albus Dumbledore, often lenient with Hagrid and known for his unorthodox approach to education, expressed concern. Though he intervened to save Buckbeak through the manipulation of time and magic, sending Harry and Hermione on their daring mission with the Time Turner, it is telling that such drastic action was necessary at all. The entire situation spiraled because one man's passion for magical creatures eclipsed his sense of responsibility. "Hagrid has a good heart," Dumbledore might have said, "but he does not always see the forest for the trees." One must also consider the broader ethical question. Should children be used as test subjects for a teacher's ideals? Because that, at its core, is what happened. Hagrid, new to teaching, wanted to impress, or we wanted to show that misunderstood creatures are noble, not monstrous. But instead of starting with nifflers, flobberworms, or bowtruckles, creatures fascinating yet relatively safe, he opened the lesson with a hippogriff, a creature whose pride is so delicate that even a misplaced glance could provoke fatal aggression. That choice speaks not only to inexperience, but to a disregard for the essential principle of child safety. And what of the students? What of Lavender Brown, who shrieked and clung to Parvati Patil during the lesson? What of Neville Longbottom, whose trembling hands couldn't even hold his wand steady, let alone master the subtle language of respectful bowing? Not all students are Harry Potter. Not all are brave or lucky or fated to be protagonists. Some are simply children, eager to learn but vulnerable. The duty of a teacher is not to endanger them for the sake of spectacle. The moment Malfoy was injured, that truth crystallized. Yet even then, Hagrid's sorrow centered not on the student, but on the creature. That inversion reveals much. Hagrid's view of magical creatures is deeply personal. Having been expelled from Hogwarts due to a misunderstanding involving Aragog, a giant acromantula, he carries a lifelong resentment toward those who judge creatures by their appearance or power. But his emotional trauma, while understandable, should not dictate pedagogical strategy. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Hagrid repeatedly frames Buckbeak's potential execution as a betrayal, not just by the Ministry, but by the world. "You've got to understand him," he pleads. "He didn't mean no harm." But neither did Malfoy, at least not in a way that justified physical injury. The entire ordeal becomes a mirror, reflecting the messy, often tragic tangle of intention, perception, and outcome. It's also crucial to examine the message this sends to other students. By presenting dangerous creatures as majestic companions rather than wild animals deserving of cautious respect, Hagrid distorts the boundary between wonder and recklessness. In doing so, he inadvertently encourages students to treat the unfamiliar as charming by default, a mindset that could lead to far graver outcomes in future encounters. Not every magical beast is like Buckbeak. Some do not forgive mistakes, some do not accept apologies. The world beyond Hogwarts is not a fairy tale. Moreover, the fallout of Hagrid's decision affects the morale and unity of the school. As the hearing for Buckbeak's fate looms, the student body divides. Gryffindors, out of loyalty to Hagrid and Harry, take up the banner of protest. Slytherins predictably back Draco and mock the notion of justice for a beast. What began as a lesson becomes a source of tension, of whispered arguments in hallways, of moral confusion in young minds. That is the true cost of irresponsibility, not just physical harm, but ideological chaos. Even Buckbeak himself, though innocent in intent, suffers the consequences. Shackled, isolated, and sentenced to death by a system that doesn't understand him, he becomes a symbol of how magical society still struggles to reconcile respect for nature with human fear. His wings, once spread over the Black Lake, now droop in captivity. It is only through the desperate bravery of two students and the intervention of a time-traveling timeline that he escapes his fate. That outcome, while narratively satisfying, does not excuse the choices that necessitated it. The situation becomes even more complicated when considering Hagrid's role, not just as a teacher, but as a figure of authority. Students look to professors for cues about what is safe, what is expected, what is admirable. By placing a hippogriff before them and framing the experience as an exciting challenge, Hagrid blurred those cues. The students were not equipped to make a judgment about whether to participate. They trusted that if a creature was brought into a lesson, it had been deemed safe. That assumption was not true, and the breach of that trust matters. It is tempting to view Hagrid's mistake through the lens of sentimentality. After all, he is beloved. But that affection should not cloud judgment. As readers, we must grapple with the dissonance between Hagrid's warmth and his missteps. We must recognize that good people can make dangerous choices, that love can lead to harm when not paired with discernment. The incident with Buckbeak is not just a subplot, it is a moral riddle woven into the fabric of Hogwarts itself. When does affection become irresponsibility? To be clear, this is not an indictment of Hagrid's character. He is brave. He is loyal. He weeps for beasts no one else loves. But he is also flawed. And in The Prisoner of Azkaban, his flaw nearly kills a student and nearly ends a creature's life. The lesson he planned was not appropriate for third years. It demanded maturity they did not yet possess, and offered risk they did not fully understand. That is not how education should work. In the end, the decision to begin with Buckbeak reflects a recurring theme in the Harry Potter series, the danger of underestimating consequences in the pursuit of idealism. It is the same danger that led Dumbledore to trust too freely, that drove Sirius Black to act without thinking, that tempts even Harry in moments of youthful zeal. Hagrid's mistake is part of that continuum. It is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the kindest intentions must be tempered by responsibility. And yet, despite everything, Buckbeak flies again. He escapes, he soars, he lives. The children are safe. The lesson is over, but the question remains. Was it worth the risk? Or did the beauty of the moment blind us to the price nearly paid? In the magical world of Hogwarts, where wonder dances with peril, that question will echo long after Buckbeak's wings disappear into the clouds. Number 25. Madame Pomfrey treated injuries without investigating the cause. Madame Pomfrey had seen more broken bones than most healers at St. Mungo's, and in the heart of the storm that was Hogwarts, she moved like a calm, efficient presence, her wand steady, her eyes focused, her voice commanding. She healed without hesitation, conjured potions with practiced grace, and returned children to class as though the hospital wing were merely a station on a larger, unstoppable train. But there was something deeply unsettling about the way her compassion seemed to halt at the edge of diagnosis. For all her talents, Madame Pomfrey never asked the question that truly mattered. How did this happen? When Harry Potter was brought to the hospital wing with no bones left in his arm, the result of Gilderoy Lockhart's botched spell, Madame Pomfrey's only visible outrage was toward the incompetence of the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. She clucked and fussed, muttered under her breath about idiotic fads, and dosed Harry with Scalar Grow. But she never demanded a formal report. She didn't request that Dumbledore summon Lockhart for questioning. She didn't suggest that Harry stay longer to ensure no lingering effects. "You will be spending the night," she said briskly. "There's no telling what that potion might do to your insides." And with that, the matter was closed. There is an unspoken danger in healing without inquiry. By fixing the body without examining the cause of injury, Madame Pomfrey became, perhaps unwittingly, the final link in a chain of negligence. In a school where children were regularly exposed to life-threatening situations, her silence was a kind of complicity. Take the incident with Draco Malfoy, who transformed into a grotesque half-ferret after being cursed by Professor Moody, or rather, Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise. There is no indication that Madame Pomfrey ever raised concern about a teacher casting humiliating transfiguration spells on a student. She healed, she sighed, she sent them back. Time and again, the hospital wing was filled with students bearing the marks of duels, curses, magical beasts, or worse, and yet the underlying systems of abuse were never addressed. The scars vanished. The danger remained. When Hermione Granger arrived in the wing with buck teeth grown past her collarbone after a duel with Draco Malfoy, she received treatment but no follow-up. No one asked what spell had been used. No disciplinary action followed. Madame Pomfrey, though sympathetic, did not push for an inquiry. The pattern became grotesquely familiar. Ron Weasley poisoned by mead meant for Dumbledore. Katie Bell cursed by a necklace intended for another. Lavender Brown mauled by Fenrir Greyback during the Battle of Hogwarts. Each time, Madame Pomfrey was the first to respond and the last to demand accountability. She wrapped wounds in bandages, knitted skin with incantations, and conjured silence from pain. When Harry appeared with a near-unconscious Cedric Diggory after the Triwizard Tournament, dead in his arms, pale and lifeless, Madame Pomfrey's role was confined to the physical. She could do nothing for Cedric, of course, but even in the chaos that followed, her focus remained strictly medical. There was no visible outrage, no suggestion that someone must be held accountable for a child returning from a school competition dead. She was not heartless, far from it, but her professional detachment functioned as a shield against the moral reckoning Hogwarts so desperately needed. The consequences of this silence were dire. Consider the second-year events when students were petrified by the Basilisk, Colin Creevey, Justin Finch-Fletchley, nearly headless Nick. Madame Pomfrey tended to their frozen forms, prepared the Mandrake restorative draught, and yet, even as student after student was laid out under white sheets, she made no public plea to Dumbledore. She did not demand a halt to classes. The threat escalated, but the treatment remained clinical, routine. "At least no one's died," she said once, a line so jarring it lingered like frost on glass. During Harry's 5th year, when Dolores Umbridge imposed her regime of fear, Harry returned from detention with bleeding scars on his hand, carved by a cursed quill that etched words into his flesh. He did not seek Pomfrey's help, and perhaps that silence says more than anything, because the students of Hogwarts knew what she would do. She would heal the wound. She would not ask questions. She would not report Umbridge. The trauma would vanish from skin, not from memory. In her own way, Madame Pomfrey enabled the culture of silence. She did not perpetuate cruelty, but she paved the way for its return. A healed student was no longer evidence, and in a castle where corridors whispered secrets and walls watched suffering, the erasure of wounds was a form of forgetting. Dumbledore, always the strategist, may have found her discretion convenient. No scandal, no inquiries, no headlines in the Daily Prophet. The hospital wing became a sanctuary of unspoken things. Neville Longbottom's repeated injuries from failed spells, the aftermath of Quidditch accidents, like when Harry's arm was shattered after Dobby jinxed the bludger. Each event was treated in isolation, never as part of a broader pattern. And the deeper concern is this: if injuries are healed without analysis, who protects the children from harm? Who documents what happened? Who changes policy? In a particularly troubling episode, Hermione was cursed with a black eye and a swollen lip during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries. Pomfrey treated her after the students were retrieved from the Ministry, but the deeper question lingers. What adult authorized or allowed a group of 15-year-olds to battle Death Eaters? What reports were filed? Pomfrey mended bruises but not broken systems. She could not. It was not her job, but that is the heart of the issue. At what point does silence become abandonment? Even magical healing has limits. Madame Pomfrey's Skeelygrow may have regrown Harry's bones, but it could not erase the trauma of Lockhart's cowardice. When George Weasley lost an ear during the flight from Privet Drive, Pomfrey saved his life, but she could not bring back the part of him that war had claimed. These were not just wounds of the body, they were wounds of a system that treated violence as curriculum. She healed, yes, but she never documented. When Fred Weasley died, no records could show that a healer had raised alarm over the increasing danger of student involvement in war. When Lavender Brown lay dying, bitten and broken, no evidence remained of warnings from within. And when Harry emerged from the Forbidden Forest, having offered himself to death, no trace existed in the hospital logs that anyone had tried to stop this spiral toward martyrdom. The trust placed in Madame Pomfrey was immense. Parents sent their children to Hogwarts believing that someone would protect them. And in many ways she did. She healed what she could, but healing without inquiry is triage, not justice. The adults of Hogwarts failed to treat the root of the disease. The violence continued not because it was unavoidable, but because it was allowed to flourish unexamined. There was, of course, a tenderness to her work. She held Harry's head after his first encounter with Quirrell. She wept silently when students returned broken from the Battle of Hogwarts. But tenderness is not the same as protection. When the Carrows tortured students in the final year, Madame Pomfrey did what she could, but her position remained that of the repairer, not the resister. In many ways, she was the final stop, the last hands to touch the wounded, but the road that brought them to her bed was paved with institutional blindness. Dumbledore's freedom-loving philosophy, the careless staffing of defence positions, the school's obsession with Quidditch, all of it led children into danger. Pomfrey patched them up, and then it started again. The question must be asked, was this truly care, or the appearance of care? A healed body looks like a solution, but the truth is deeper. Madame Pomfrey's silence became the plaster over the cracks of Hogwarts. A child with broken fingers from a duel, fixed; a girl cursed into paralysis, restored; a boy burned by a rogue spell, mended, but no one was ever held accountable. And so it happened again. She did not choose to be complicit, but in a system where silence is safety, even kindness can be dangerous. Healing without justice is a quiet form of surrender. The walls of Hogwarts echoed with pain, and no one was counting. Madame Pomfrey did her job, but that job may have been part of the problem. In the end, the legacy of Madame Pomfrey is a paradox. She was the healer who made Hogwarts survivable. And yet, because of her, Hogwarts never changed.